around in the blowdowns knew, all that down material is very, very likely to burn as well. And it took a few years, but there were fires in 2006 and 2007 that burned about 100,000 acres, a big chunk of the area that blew down. And a few photos remind us what these fires were like. These are the first really major fires in a long time in this part of the world. Our crews were out there actually resurveying following the blowdown when the fires happened. This is a sequence of photos from a couple of days, July 14th, July 15th in the afternoon. This is on Seagull Lake. This morning, July 16th, they stopped censusing. Later in the afternoon, they decided to get out of there. That's where Cavity Lake Fire was making its really big run across the landscape. Creates its own weather. And it's a very big event. And this is some photos of what the landscape looked like afterwards. It didn't burn everywhere, just like the blowdown didn't blow everything down. Wind and fire contribute to heterogeneity and diversity of the landscape because they don't equally impact everywhere. So our research crews headed out back to the field sites as soon as the Forest Service let us get back out there. With a changed goals, though, we couldn't follow what was just happening just by wind. Now we're studying the combination of blowdown and 7 years later fire. And so we set out to survey fire severity, which is just how much a given plot would burn. Again, going back to Roy's 740 sites now, looking at residual fuel, because even after fire, once this can burn again, this fuel's still there, and looking at regrowth following the fire. Just a couple of shots of what this landscape looked like in the immediate aftermath. Places like this, all of the duff. Sure. If you didn't hear that, basically she was asking if you can pay without credit card because their machine is messing up. There seems to be all sorts of electronic failures here in Helios today.
If you have to do it, I mean, they'll do it by hand.
They will do it by hand, but if you have cash, I think it would be greatly appreciated. So.
Did you ever see at the store?
Getting back to the fire, not only with the vegetation burned, but most of the soil and organic matter was burned as well, really driving back the system to an earlier stage. Pretty hard work, some pretty dirty workers having a good time though, most of the time. And then the following spring there's the Ham Lake fire, which basically a somewhat different fire because it's a spring fire rather than a summer fire, but also burned another big chunk of the landscape in the Gunflint area. Just a couple of photos here of this as well. And our crews went out to resurvey after that fire as well. So we probably have a uniquely large data set in all the world to look at combinations of blowdown and fire. And I like this photo just to remind us that this tree, before the fire, the soil was up to here probably, because that's the way the roots would start to grow. So we actually used this measure of trees to figure out how much duff there had been in the forest and how much had been burned. And for these forests, the boundary waters forests, northern Minnesota forests, are not very productive in the first place. This is cold and very rocky soil. But it took a long time for the soil to develop. And these fires burned away a lot of that soil, pushing back the productivity. Now, in the boundary waters, it doesn't really matter whether it's productive because we're not growing trees there for any other purpose other than have wilderness nature. But it is an indicator of the kind of change that happens in these systems. Now, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, these systems are fire evolved, fire adapted. And so although these fires are very severe, most of these species have mechanisms to come back within a fairly short time. If you go up there now, in some places you can't tell there was a fire 3 or 4 years ago, other than there aren't very large trees in the forest floor. But right away you have recovery by sprouts, even in these very hot burned areas. Birch, maple, aspen, hazel, and others will sprout back from living roots. Other species recover by seed relatively quickly, including jack pine, raspberry, Then there's recovery by surviving in refuges, such as many of our trees, which then can seed back out into the burned areas. And most of the burned areas were never more than 100 yards or so from residual trees. So there is seed that can go back out into the burned landscape. So recovery is happening, and we actually were able to use the 2003 prescribed fire by the Forest Service on 3 Mile Island to look in more detail by going to plots that we had censused before the fire. Usually you don't know where the fire is going to happen or when. Prescribed wildfire in boreal forests is not very common, and you can see why. This is not like a little grass fire in the prairies. This is a fire with 100, 200 feet flame heights. So you have to have special conditions when you can do this and be assured you're not going to burn down the most nearest houses or forests that you don't want to burn. But what we saw here is that birch, especially, but hazel and aspen also do really well after fire. This is in 2007. And that jack pine did surprisingly well, even though there weren't many surviving jack pine cones from the 1999 blowdown. And no one really knows how long their seeds will stick around for. But jack pine has done fairly well as well. And so the kind of winners so far from the combination of wind and fire are birch, surprisingly to me, northern white cedar, seeded in underneath the birch very well, and then spots jack pine. So an interesting thing is, if you go back to the 1890s in the pre-settlement landscape, birch and aspen were actually comparable in abundance. Birch was actually slightly more abundant than aspen. Through logging and fire suppression, we now have 6 or 7 times more aspen in the landscape than birch in most places. But these wind and fire suggest that under natural disturbance, birch holds its own with aspen. That one reason we've lost so much birch, which many people aren't aware of, is that it's not as adapted to logging and fire suppression as aspen is, and that it's doing quite well following these recent disturbances. Red pine, tamarack weren't very common in the first place in this landscape and seem to have disappeared pretty much entirely. So I've kind of walked us through ancient history and more recent history. But what about now and the future? I'm going to give us some highlights, maybe we should call them lowlights of 21st century climate warming, and taking us out of the Minnesota context to the world more at large. Global surface temperature has increased and is especially going to increase, especially high latitudes in mid-continent, such as Minnesota to the Arctic. So our climate change should be greater than the global average. The biggest effects of climate change will not be just warming in itself, but more intense and longer droughts, as well as more frequent and more intense precipitation events. We may get the same amount of moisture, but if it comes in less frequently and we go from flood to drought, that's not necessarily going to be very good for our ecosystems. I also like to take us out of our comfortable Minnesota lifestyle here, where we certainly worry about the boundary waters, and we should. But the poor people of the world, especially in many third world countries, are the ones who are really going to take the brunt of the impact of global climate change. Here's just a few consequences of climate change that are likely to impact hundreds of millions of people. Not just hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of millions. Things such as increased death and disease from extreme events, heat waves, floods, tsunamis, storms, fires, droughts, and the like. Increased malnutrition due to drought, poor crop yields. Increases in malaria, dengue, and diarrheal diseases. So some very, very severe impacts on the poor people all around the world. And I try myself to try to keep that in mind when I also worry about our forests and our own natural ecosystems and our social and economic systems. But bringing us back to Minnesota, as I mentioned, climate scientists think things have become more extreme. And this is a slide from Mark Seeley, the state climatologist, showing from 2007 something that at least represents this. Again, we can't tell whether this is strictly due to climate change. But here within a 2-week period in 2007, we had 24 counties that were drought disaster and another 32 that were eligible for federal assistance. The drought disaster counties are shown in X's, almost the entire state. And then 13 days later, huge rainstorms, 500-year, 13-inch rainstorms.